Thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of the book On Guard by William Lane Craig from my atheist perspective. In this video, we're going to cover Chapter 6 of On Guard, which is titled, Can We Be Good Without God? Craig begins by clarifying what he means by the question in the chapter title. It would be ignorant and arrogant to presume that people who don't believe in God can't be good. But that isn't the question. The question is, can we be good without God, as in without God existing? Are our values, including our concepts of good and evil, mere social conventions, or are they objective, existing independent of our personal opinions? In other words, it's the moral argument. Craig could have just titled this book Greatest Hits. I suspect he didn't want to just come out and admit that he was recycling old material, though anyone who's ever heard him speak more than once knows that that's almost all he ever does. Anyway, it's an old idea, Craig tells us, that the existence of morality points to the existence of God. The Cambridge professor of moral philosophy, William Sorley, argued in the early 20th century that God provides the best, most rational basis for both the natural order and moral values. Craig says, quote, Sorley maintains that there is an objective moral order which is as real and independent of us as is the natural order of things. He recognizes that in one sense we can't prove that objective moral values exist, but he points out that in this same sense, we can't prove that the natural world of physical objects exists either. You could be a body lying in the matrix, experiencing a virtual reality. The moral order and the natural order are thus on a similar footing. Just as we assume the reality of the world of objects on the basis of our sense experience, so we assume the reality of the moral order on the basis of our moral experience. And this will become the most important idea in this chapter for Craig. And I think Craig is being a bit shallow in his thinking here. Surprising for a professional philosopher, not so surprising for an apologist who has demonstrated several times in this book already that he's willing to twist facts and arguments in order to get to his preferred conclusion. It's true that the external world, that is the world outside of our minds, and morality are similar in the sense that we can't prove they exist for 100% certainty because we have only our own experiences to go on. And that is assuming, of course, that morality is an objective thing. If we assume that morality is subjective and that it is actually tied to us and our minds and our cultures, etc., then of course we can prove that it exists because that's the nature of it. We don't have to prove that it exists in the external world as some sort of object. We experience it, we feel it, we make judgments based on it. It exists just as surely as reason and emotions and other things that we experience in that way exist. But assuming that it's an objective thing out there somewhere beyond our minds, then no, we can't prove 100% for certain that objective morals exist. But that doesn't mean that the external world and objective morality are comparable, generally speaking. The biggest difference between the two is that it's fairly easy to reach a consensus with other people about basic facts regarding the external world. We can make observations, have those observations confirmed by other people who have made the same observations, formulate theories, make predictions to test those theories. And none of that proves to a 100% certainty that the external world is really there. It could all be an illusion existing in our own mind, or my mind, as the case may be, but the apparent fact that we can observe, explore, and test the external world, check with each other to see how our individual experiences line up, and create a mostly consistent, coherent picture of it, strongly suggests that it's really there, that something exists outside our minds, and we have a reasonably reliable concept of what it is. But the way we experience morality is very different. True, there is such a thing as a moral consensus. There are certain values that seem pretty close to universal. But the way we interact with moral values is not the same as the way we interact with the external world. The nature of moral values is fundamentally different. If two people disagree about something regarding an object in the external world, that disagreement can probably be settled by examining the object or by appealing to the judgment of an impartial third party. If I say that it's an apple and you say that it's an orange, and we ask 100 people what they think it is, and 99 of them say that's an orange, we can safely say that it's an orange. Plus, apple and orange are fairly well-defined concepts, and pretty much everyone agrees on their defining characteristics. We can examine the object and see if it fits the description of an apple or an orange and settle the dispute. But disagreements on matters of morality aren't so easily solved. If I think a starving person stealing a loaf of bread to feed their family is morally acceptable, and you think it's morally unacceptable, we can each articulate our reasons for feeling the way we feel about it. We can cite examples, we can argue about it all day, and one of us might even persuade the other to change their mind. But we can never prove that stealing the bread is objectively right or objectively wrong. We can no more prove the correctness of a given moral judgment than we can prove that it's correct to say that The Wizard of Oz is a better film than Gone with the Wind. It's not an objective matter. To even try to objectively prove such a thing is to misunderstand the nature of the thing in question. As before, Craig states the argument in logical form. Premise 1, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2, objective moral values and duties do exist. Premise 3, therefore, God exists. I think this is one of the weakest of all of Craig's standard arguments, and that's saying something, but Craig doesn't seem to think so. Quite the contrary, in fact. He says, quote, "What makes this argument so powerful is that people generally believe both premises. In a pluralistic age, students are scared to death of imposing their values on someone else. So premise 1 seems correct to them because of its implicit relativism. At the same time, certain values have been deeply instilled into them, such as tolerance, open-mindedness, and love. They think it's objectively wrong to impose your values on someone else. So they're deeply committed to premise 2 as well. Checkmate, students! I don't see how not wishing to impose your values on someone else has anything to do with whether or not you accept Craig's first premise. Craig seems to think that the students he's referencing would accept it because it affirms two things that he imagines they believe, that there is no God and that objective morals don't exist. The problem with that premise is that the existence of objective moral values doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the existence of God. The existence of any God, let alone the one Craig believes in, is not a necessary condition for the existence of objective moral values. Craig disagrees with this, obviously, and his defense of that premise is coming up in a bit. Craig also tries to demonstrate that despite their statements to the contrary, his straw students actually do believe that objective moral values exist because they believe it's objectively wrong to impose their values on others. It's a clever trick, but he doesn't pull it off. If objective moral values exist, Craig should be able to demonstrate that they exist regardless of the opinions or beliefs or actions of students or anyone else. All Craig can do is demonstrate that some people who don't believe in objective moral values might sometimes think or act in ways that are inconsistent with that belief, that are more consistent with a belief in the existence of moral values. If a person doesn't believe objective moral values exist, but also acts as though it's objectively wrong to impose one's values on someone else, the most that proves is that that person is inconsistent in the way they apply their values to the way they lead their life. It doesn't prove the existence of objective moral values. This argument by Craig is essentially the Roadrunner tactic, which was championed by Norman Geisler and Frank Turek in their book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, which I went through in an earlier An Atheist Reads video, a series a few years ago. Show some inconsistency in an opponent's position or phrase their argument in a way that makes it appear self-contradictory and declare victory. and then run off in a cloud of smoke like the Roadrunner. That is the Roadrunner tactic, which is championed and recommended by Norman Geisler and Frank Turek, and practiced, although not called such, by William Lane Craig. Well, Craig pads out his page count in this chapter by describing in great detail the distinction between values and duties, when his own brief definition contained in a sidebar on one page does the job just fine in a few sentences. A moral value refers to worth, whether a given person or action is good or bad. A moral duty refers to an obligation to act in a certain way, and it involves not good and bad, but notions of right and wrong. He likewise labors over the distinction between subjective and objective when, again, his own sidebar provides the only explanation that's necessary. Objective means independent of human opinion, and subjective means dependent on human opinion. Now, finally, he offers a defense of the first premise. Why do objective moral values require the existence of God? Craig begins his defense by stating that traditionally, moral values have been based on God. Which God? Whose tradition? He doesn't say. He transitions straight from tradition says to his assertion that without God there is no basis for moral values. Craig lists several things which he claims don't provide a good basis for objective moral values. Science, a naturalistic or atheistic worldview, evolution. All we're left with in a world without God are subjective moral values, herd morality that evolves with the species but doesn't show why there should be things that we objectively value, why we should objectively value, for instance, human life. Craig gives the same treatment to moral duties. He states that moral duties are traditionally thought to originate with God, and this time he does specifically mention the Ten Commandments, so as if we didn't know what God he was talking about. He questions where moral duties would come from without God being in the picture, and he spends the next few pages talking about how animals don't have moral obligations to each other, and without God, humans would just be animals, so we wouldn't have moral obligations either. If there is no moral lawgiver, he says, in summary, then there is no objective moral law which we must obey. And this is yet another statement which Craig makes as though it's self-evidently true, but I don't see it that way. I don't think objective moral laws exist at all, and I am not troubled by that, but I'll get to that in a few minutes. But if they did, if there were such things as objective moral laws, I don't see why their existence would necessitate the existence of a moral lawgiver. Why couldn't moral laws be analogous to the laws of physics? Why couldn't they work in a similar way? Why couldn't they describe the way things work in moral terms, just as the laws of physics describe how things work in physical terms? Why could they not simply be conditions that are a part of the universe, the same as every other condition and characteristic of the universe? Craig also treats the necessity of God for the existence of objective morals as though it's self-evident. When discussing moral values and duties, he announces that both are traditionally linked to God, describes how various things that aren't God are incapable of providing a basis for them, then declares that God is necessary. But he never actually explains why God is necessary, or how we can logically reason backward from the existence of objective moral values and duties to the existence of God. He never establishes any link between God and objective morality. Let's assume that objective moral values and duties do exist. Why must God also exist? Craig's argument depends on that connection, but he never explicitly makes that connection. He assumes that connection when he starts his three-point argument. In premise one, the connection has already been made. There is no argument to establish why the existence of God is necessary for the existence of objective moral values, and therefore the existence of one points to the existence of another. Without God, there can be no objective moral values, he says. But he never explains why. He never demonstrates why the concept of objective morality apart from God is absurd. He clearly thinks that, but he never demonstrates how. He describes a few things that he says can't provide a basis for objective morality, but that's not the same thing. Even if we assume his opinion on whether or not, for instance, science can provide a basis for objective morality to be inarguable. Even if we agree on Craig with everything that he says can't provide a good basis for objective morality, he still needs to demonstrate why God does provide a not only good but necessary basis for objective morality, and he simply doesn't do that. He never even really tries to do that. If there was a God, and that God handed down moral laws, what exactly would require us to accept those laws? Why would God's opinion or God's standard, because it's not God's opinion exactly in Craig's reckoning, we'll get to that in a minute, why would God's version of what is right and what was wrong, what was good and what was bad, be binding on everyone? Why would we have no choice but to agree and to accept that standard? Craig never explains that. He seems to simply assume that part of God's nature is having the power to define objective moral principles. But as with the other attributes he assigns to God, he never explains why we should believe that God possesses that attribute or how God is able to do this. He simply defines God in such a way that that is a characteristic of God and then expects everyone to just accept that characteristic once he makes what he thinks is his logical case for the existence of God. He tries to sort of grandfather everything in. He bundles everything he needs in his God up. And then he says, logical argument, logical argument, logical argument, therefore God must exist. And he expects us to just accept all the stuff that he snuck into God before he made the argument that God must exist. And I think my main problem with what Craig is trying to do here is that trick that he tries to pull that I just described. He's talking about God as though God is special, as though God has all of these unique attributes that nothing else has or could have. But he doesn't bother to explain how God is special or even how he knows that God is special. He doesn't account for how or why God can do any of these things that Craig says God must do. He simply defines God in that way and expects us to accept it. He just kind of says it. But more than that, he ties that specialness into logical arguments as though it would be illogical not to agree with him, as though his beliefs are simply the reasonable conclusions that anyone should come to after examining the evidence. He fails to establish that God is necessary for the existence of objective morality. Instead, he talks about things that aren't necessary for the existence of objective morality and then declares God to be necessary as though it's a process of elimination, and if God's the only option left, then it must be so. He also fails to establish that objective moral values even exist. He does at least try, though, with the off-brand Roadrunner tactic involving the imaginary students. His argument seems to be people have believed objective moral values exist for a long time, and even people who don't believe in them sometimes speak or behave as though they do, and lots of people feel like they do, therefore they must. And I don't find that terribly persuasive. Again and again, Craig appeals to tradition or swats down someone else's position without bothering to actually demonstrate the validity of his own. He seems to regard his own position as the default. As long as he can show why people with other propositions are wrong, then he must be automatically right. Well, Craig answers the Euthyphro Dilemma, which asks if something is good because God wills it, or if God wills something because it's good. Craig solves this by declaring it a false dilemma, saying that God wills something because he is good. This is where we get to what I mentioned a moment ago about the erasing the element of opinion in God's morality. Craig is saying that God's goodness emanates from his nature, that goodness itself, the standard of what is good and what is bad, is based on the nature of God. It's not independent of God. It's not God's opinion on something. It's not a choice that God makes. It is simply how God is. It is a part of his being. And therefore, it is not arbitrary and it is not subjective in Craig's reckoning, because it just simply is. It's just a part of who God is. He is the perfect, pure embodiment of goodness. But my question is, what obligates anyone else to regard God as good? Craig says that the standard of God's nature determines what is good, but why is that standard objective and transcendent and inarguable? What makes God's nature truly, ultimately, objectively good? Why must we agree that God is perfectly, transcendently good? And even if we accept that such a thing makes sense, how do we know that God's nature is good? Even if we accept that God is the standard for good, how do we know that God's nature is good? Who told us? In Christianity, the ultimate source for all information about God is God himself. Is it not at least conceivable that God is giving us unreliable information? Craig would argue that God wouldn't do that because God doesn't lie, but you can see the problem there already, can't you? Craig addresses the proposition that objective moral values simply exist independently of anyone or anything else. This was proposed by Plato and is therefore referred to in this text as moral Platonism. Craig says, quote, "First, atheistic moral Platonism seems unintelligible. What does it mean to say, for example, that the moral value justice just exists? It's hard to make sense of this. It's easy to understand what it means to say that some person is just, but it's bewildering when someone says that in the absence of any people, justice itself exists. Moral values seem to be properties of persons, and it's hard to understand how justice can exist as an abstraction." Well, I'm confused as to why Craig is confused. Either moral values exist objectively or they don't. If they exist objectively, if they aren't dependent on our opinions, or indeed on anyone's opinions, then why can't someone propose that justice just exists? Craig has trouble with the idea of moral values being both properties of persons and abstractions, but we deal with this sort of thing all the time. It's the difference between an object or property that exists in the external world and the construct we use to be able to think about it and talk about that object or property. Justice, for example, could simply be the construct we've come up with to describe a corresponding property that occurs in the world. In this way, justice or some other moral concept would be similar to, say, density. The concept of density is a construct that we invented to label and define a property of objects in the world we observed. The property itself really exists, as far as we can verify such things, and would conceivably be able to exist even in the absence of objects that exhibit density. But the concept of density that we have attached to that property is a construct. It exists as both a construct and as an actual property in the universe. So objective moral values, I don't see why they couldn't function in some similar way. Even if there aren't beings or objects to which you could attribute the property of justice, the conditions of the universe would still be such that justice could exist, that justice could be a property of an object, if such an object ever existed. If objective moral values existed in the way moral Platonism proposes they do, we could refer to how just something was in the same way we refer to how dense something is. Objective moral values would simply exist as another set of properties present in the universe. And Craig seems to think this is preposterous, but it makes at least as much sense to me as the God he's proposing as the source and transcendent standard for everything. It makes more sense, actually, since we could assume that moral properties originated with every other property of our universe in the Big Bang, or however our universe came to be, and we would have no need to suppose the existence of an eternal, omnipotent, totally unsubstantiated, and unprecedented being like Craig's God. But Craig has another problem with moral Platonism, one related to what I just said. Quote, "It's fantastically improbable that the blind evolutionary process should spit forth precisely that sort of creatures who correspond to the abstractly existing realm of moral values. This seems to be an utterly incredible coincidence when you think about it. It's almost as if the moral realm knew that we were coming. This is kind of a Ray Comfort level argument, isn't it? Again, I think Craig's stated incredulity speaks more to his own lack of imagination and comprehension than to any weaknesses in the concept of moral Platonism. Would we consider it improbable or an incredible coincidence if an object with any other property just so happened to evolve in a universe where that property existed? Should we be incredulous that stars just so happened to evolve in a universe where hydrogen atoms are able to undergo thermonuclear fusion? Should we ask ourselves if the universe knew those stars were coming and arranged things accordingly? In the early universe, before the first stars formed, the potential for thermonuclear fusion existed, but it had never actually happened. Then, at some point, objects capable of carrying out thermonuclear fusion appeared. Why can't objective morality have worked in a similar way? The objective moral properties existed, or had the potential to exist, but it wasn't until the appearance of beings sophisticated enough to have a moral awareness that those properties actually became active and evident. Craig also objects to the notion that humanism provides a good basis for objective morality. Why should we value that which is conducive to human flourishing over that which is conducive to the flourishing of, say, mice? What's so special about humans? He also finds it implausible that certain moral properties necessarily attach themselves to given actions. Quote, "These humanistic philosophers have simply taken a shopping list approach to ethical questions. Because they hold to humanism, they just help themselves to the moral properties they need to do the job. What's needed to make their view plausible is some sort of explanation for why moral properties attach to certain natural states of affairs." And in the very next paragraph, Craig declares that God is a natural foundation for objective moral values and duties because he is the ultimate reality and, by definition, worthy of worship and the embodiment of perfect goodness. But it's the humanistic philosophers who are practicing shopping list philosophy. Right. I find Craig's insistence that God is necessary for objective morality to exist implausible. What's needed to make his view plausible is some sort of explanation for why objective moral principles must be determined in some way by God. In that same paragraph, where Craig declares God to be worthy of worship and the embodiment of goodness by definition, he also says that, by definition, God is the greatest conceivable being and the source of goodness. Why doesn't he save us all some time and simply say that his God exists and all of his other positions are objectively correct by definition? Can I get you to agree with me that Superman is the source of all moral values and duties if I say that Superman is that source by definition? And also, Superman must exist by definition. Are you convinced? Am I right? Will you admit that I'm right? I said it was by definition. Finally, Craig gets around to defending premise 2 of his moral argument, if you can remember back that far. I will refresh your memory. Premise 2 is that objective moral values and duties do exist. Quote, "Philosophers who reflect on our moral experience see no more reason to distrust that experience than the experience of our 5 senses. I believe what my 5 senses tell me, namely that there is a world of physical objects out there. My senses are not infallible, but that doesn't lead me to think there is no external world around me. Similarly, in the absence of some reason to distrust my moral experience, I should accept what it tells me, namely that some things are objectively good or evil, right or wrong." Once again, he is describing morals as if they function the same way as objects that exist in the external world. But strangely, he seemed utterly baffled by something like moral Platonism, which treats morals as exactly that. As I said earlier, to liken morality to the external world is to misunderstand how morality seems to work. If objective moral values did exist, if they were truly independent of our own opinions, then whether they were properties of the universe, like those described by the laws of physics, or rooted somehow in the nature of Craig's God, or someone else's God, we should be able to examine them and demonstrate them in much the same way that we're able to observe other objects or properties that exist in the external world. But we can't do that. Morality doesn't work that way. It's not a matter of our senses being fallible, of not being able to trust our moral experience. It's a matter of understanding the nature of that experience. And the nature of that experience is inescapably subjective. Craig says that his moral experience tells him that some things are objectively good or evil, right or wrong, but can he prove that? If he and someone else disagree on a matter of morality, can he demonstrate objectively that he is correct and the other person is incorrect? If we're presented with a cannonball and a sofa pillow, and you say the cannonball weighs more, and I say the sofa pillow weighs more, we can settle that argument. We can observe. We can test. We can determine which object weighs more. And assuming we're both acting in good faith and we agree on certain basic facts, one of us will have to admit that the other was wrong. But what if our disagreement is over something that by its very nature isn't quantifiable? What if you say that baseball is the best sport and I say American football is the best sport? First of all, you're right. I'd never actually say football is the best sport or even a particularly good sport. I hate football. But just for the sake of argument, let's say I say football is the best sport. How do you demonstrate to me that baseball is objectively the better sport? You can tell me why you prefer baseball. You can tell me what about baseball appeals to you and what about football doesn't appeal to you. You can wax poetic about the beauty of baseball, its grace, its history, the skill and speed and grace it demands from those who play it at the highest levels, but you're still just sharing your personal opinions. It might provide me with an insight into you and your personal tastes, but it doesn't settle our disagreement. I could just as easily wax poetic about the beauty and grace and history of football. Again, hypothetically speaking. We'll never be able to objectively demonstrate that our preferred sport is better than the other because that's not the nature of the disagreement. Which of these objects weighs the most is a question pertaining to a matter of fact. Which of these things is better is a question pertaining to a matter of opinion. And I submit that while morality is more complex than a mere matter of an individual's personal opinion, it is subjective and not objective in nature. Craig can insist all he wants that his personal moral experience tells him that objective moral values exist. That means nothing. If I were more self-centered, I might believe that my favorite film is objectively the greatest film ever made, or that my favorite sport, which is actually baseball, by the way, is objectively the best, or that my values are objectively superior to values of other people. But that wouldn't make any of those things actually objectively true. A subjective judgment doesn't become objectively true just because you think it is. When he can't demonstrate that objective morals actually exist, Craig resorts to appeals to emotion. He observes that most of us recognize that sexual abuse of another person is wrong, and that rape, torture, and child abuse are moral abominations. That is, they are really objectively bad. On the flip side, love and generosity are really objectively good. Quote, "People who fail to see this are just handicapped, and the moral equivalent of someone who is physically blind. And there's no reason to let their impairment call into question what we see clearly." What do you even call that, what he just did there? Moral ableism? If you don't see things my way, there's something wrong with you. And then he shamelessly appeals to the proud lack of impairment of his readers. We see this all very clearly. There's nothing wrong with us. It's crucial to recognize that he's not saying people who fail to recognize that child abuse is bad and generosity is good are morally impaired. He's saying people who fail to recognize that child abuse is objectively bad and generosity is objectively good are morally impaired. In other words, people who fail to recognize the existence of objective moral values are impaired. In yet other words, people who disagree with me are morally impaired. Because here's the thing, I'll agree with him that child abuse is bad and generosity is good. In fact, humbly speaking, I would even place myself ahead of him in the thinking child abuse is bad Olympics, because unlike Craig, I've never tried to morally justify the slaughtering of children. But I don't think I agree with Craig that these things are objectively good or bad. And that's not because I don't think they're really all that bad. This is the trick Craig tries to pull. Just as when he was discussing the concepts of value and meaning in a previous chapter, he talks about morality as though moral values that aren't objective and transcendent don't count. If your life doesn't have an objective, transcendent value determined by his eternal and omnipotent God, then it doesn't really have any value. By the same token, if moral values don't exist objectively and transcendently, then they don't really exist at all. So if I say child abuse is wrong, but I won't say child abuse is objectively wrong, it must be because I don't actually think child abuse is that bad. I don't care about the welfare of children. I have a hardness of heart, as Craig writes in describing a moral relativist later in the chapter. After all, I think it's just a matter of opinion or social convention. I don't think it's really wrong. But again, this misunderstands the nature of morality. I don't think it's meaningful to speak of moral judgments in objective terms. I just don't think it works that way. I can explain to you why I think child abuse is wrong. I can explain why I think it's good that child abuse is against the law, and why no society that tolerates the abuse of children should expect to survive and flourish for very long, and why I think it's one of the most indefensible and despicable crimes imaginable. I can verbally eviscerate anyone who tries to defend it or people who are guilty of it. I can get real worked up over the utter, egregious, all-encompassing wrongness of child abuse. But can I demonstrate to you that it is objectively, unquestionably wrong? No. Not because I don't believe it's wrong. Not because I think the opposite opinion is at all defensible, but because that isn't the nature of moral positions. Sometimes a person with Craig's position will attempt to respond to someone with my position by pressuring the person on my side to come up with an instance where child abuse, for example, would be permissible. And then the person on my side is usually unable or unwilling to name such an instance, which is one reason why Craig and others who make this argument choose such reprehensible crimes. In the absence of any hypothetical examples of acceptable child abuse, the person on Craig's side will declare that child abuse must be simply and objectively wrong, because no one, even a person arguing against the idea of objective morality, can name a circumstance in which it would be morally acceptable. But again, this argument misses the point. When Craig argues that a given thing is objectively wrong, he isn't arguing that it's wrong in every conceivable circumstance. He's arguing that its wrongness is a matter of objective fact, just like the weight of a cannonball is an objective fact. Something can be considered wrong in every conceivable circumstance in a subjective moral framework. If you and I and everyone else agree that child abuse is wrong in all circumstances, that means we have a moral consensus on that issue. And that's important, because moral consensus is how communities and societies set their shared moral standards. It influences expectations of how people should behave. It shapes laws and customs and common concepts of justice and fairness. But it doesn't render the thing about which there is a consensus ultimately objective. Ultimately, morality is always subjective. And by the way, as long as we're talking child abuse as our example, it's worth noting that, as I alluded to earlier, while most people might not be able to think of a circumstance where child abuse is morally permissible, William Lane Craig could and has defended it publicly. And that circumstance is when God tells you to. It's just a personal preference of mine. Your mileage may vary, and that's perfectly fine. But I don't accept lectures on morality from people who argue seriously that anything their God does is by definition good, including the mass murder of children. I get off there. Maybe that's my taxi cab fallacy. Craig spends a few pages defending his assertion that we can trust our moral experience just as we can trust our sensory experience. Again, I think the issue is that Craig is misunderstanding or misrepresenting the nature of moral experience. Then he responds to the objection that if our capacity for morality is the result of evolution, just as the rest of our traits, then certain values must have been ingrained in us, not because they reflect some objective truth, but rather because they are conducive to the survival and health of our species. If this is true, then we can't trust our moral experience, and we can't assume that premise 2 is true. It's not about trusting or not trusting your moral experience. Craig says, quote, "There are two problems with this objection to our knowledge of premise 2. First, it assumes that atheism is true. If there is no God, then our moral beliefs are selected by evolution solely for their survival value, not for their truth. Apart from the assumption of atheism, we have no reason to deny what our moral experience tells us. Second, the objection is self-defeating. Given the truth of naturalism, all our beliefs, not just our moral beliefs, are the result of evolution and social conditioning. Thus, the evolutionary account leads to skepticism about knowledge in general. The objection, therefore, undermines itself. So, given the warrant provided for premise 2 by our moral experience, we're justified in thinking that objective moral values and duties exist." Okay, so there are a few things there. First, the objection doesn't assume atheism is true. It assumes our moral values don't originate with God. It's possible to conceive of a God who exists but who takes no hand in the shaping of moral values. One does not have to assume atheism to deny the existence of objective morality or of a God that plays some role in determining morality. In fact, I would argue that even if Craig's God existed, morality would still be ultimately subjective, because that is its nature. Even if God existed, you couldn't settle moral disagreements by citing God's standard of right and wrong unless you could also establish why God's standards are necessarily binding on everyone to the point that no one is allowed to dissent. There's no such thing as just right or just wrong. It doesn't work that way. Also, we should be skeptical about knowledge in general. Not excessively so, not to the point that we begin to doubt our senses without good reason for doing so, but there should always be a willingness to acknowledge that everything we know about the external world is the result of our senses as interpreted by our brains, that every fact is provisional, that we know nothing for 100% certain. Craig's argument is rooted in this misunderstanding, possibly honest, possibly willful, of the nature of moral experience. His argument boils down to, we feel like certain things are objectively wrong or objectively right, and since I can't think of any reasons to doubt that feeling, it must be true. The ironic thing is that when Craig dismisses people who have markedly different moral experiences from his own as impaired, he is essentially appealing to just the sort of moral consensus that his argument seeks to render irrelevant. He's saying that most of us have a roughly similar moral experience, where we generally agree that certain things are right and certain things are wrong, and people who disagree on those things are just aberrations that should be disregarded. The fact that most of us agree means that those values we agree on are just true. He's acknowledging the existence and importance of the moral consensus, but he's using it to make the wrong point. The moral consensus doesn't prove that morality is objective or that moral values are determined independent of human input. Quite the opposite. It shows that morality is ultimately subjective and a product of human input, and that's a good thing. And I think it's quite telling that when Craig does try to appeal to some standard or some real-world condition to prove that morals are objective, he doesn't appeal to the standard of his God because he can't demonstrate objectively what that standard is or why we should all accept it. The only thing he can appeal to is the moral consensus, which doesn't prove what he thinks it proves. All he can say is, well, most of us agree that these things are right and these things are wrong, which isn't a point that's in dispute. But he's arguing with that point as though that proves his contention that morals are objective. And actually, I think if you understand the way the moral consensus works, it demonstrates exactly the opposite. Contrary to what Craig says, morality that was handed down to us from on high, based on some separate pre-existing standard we had nothing to do with, isn't morality at all. It's a set of arbitrary rules we're expected to simply follow without question. It's good and bad and right and wrong by definition, not as the result of human experience. Morality is subjective, and I'm glad it is. I'm glad our morals come from us, from our families, our communities, our conflicts and our resolutions to those conflicts, our compassion, our empathy, our desire for peace and fairness and equality. I'm glad our morals can change and grow as we do. Boy, am I glad about that. We all should be very glad about that. It's imperfect, of course, like every other aspect of our species, but I wouldn't want it to be any other way. More to the point, I don't think it could be any other way. And despite his efforts in this chapter, William Lane Craig has not even come close to convincing me that it could be any way other than it is, which is that morality, much like language, much like mathematics, is a human construct. And it must be so. It's the only way it makes sense. Well, that's it for Chapter 6. Next, we'll deal with Chapter 7, which is titled, What About Suffering? That'll be fun, won't it? So that's in the next video. Thank you all as always for watching this video. I appreciate your attention. I appreciate you finding some value in this thing that I'm doing. If you have something to say in response to something I have had to say in this video, please do leave a comment. Be you atheist, Christian, or some other stripe of believer or non-believer, I'm very interested in anything you might have to say in response to something I have had to say here. If you enjoy these videos and the other videos I do, please consider supporting this channel through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives to become a patron for as little as $1 a month. And every one of those $1 a month pledges is so greatly appreciated and really, really helps me out. So if you can only afford $1 a month and you're thinking, well, I don't really want to pledge because I can only afford $1, please, 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 the $1 a month pledges really, really help me out. If you can afford to pledge a little bit more, at say $5 a month or more, you can take advantage of some extra perks built into the Patreon campaign, including getting a sneak peek at the scripts of the Atheist Reads videos, which are published the day before the videos go live. But if you pledge at any level, or if you can't afford to pledge on Patreon and you just watch the videos and share them and like and subscribe and leave comments and do all of those other wonderful things, whatever form your support comes in, I truly, truly appreciate it. And I thank you for your attention, and I will see you next time.